My husband's girl best friend looked me dead in the eye at the most exclusive charity gala in Atlanta and whispered that he was only with me because she was already married. She actually smiled while saying I was nothing but a consolation prize for his waiting heart. She thought I was just the quiet and safe choice who would stand by and let her disrespect my marriage. She had absolutely no idea that while she was busy trying to steal my husband and my position, I was quietly buying up the mortgage debt on her crumbling mansion. I did not scream or cry. I simply shattered her delusions and showed her exactly why he chose me to be his wife. Before I dive into how I dismantled her entire life in one night, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to put a toxic woman in her place and protect what is yours. From the outside, Marcus and I were the absolute definition of black excellence. We were the Atlanta power couple that everyone envied and admired. He was 34 years old, a brilliant investment fund manager, with perfectly tailored suits and a smile that could disarm any corporate boardroom. I was 32, a luxury real estate developer who had fought tooth and nail to build my own empire in an incredibly demanding and male-dominated industry. Our penthouse in Buckhead was an architectural masterpiece. It was filled with contemporary art by local black artists, floor-to-ceiling windows, and the kind of quiet luxury that screams generational wealth. We had the money, the status, and the picture-perfect image. But beneath the glossy surface of our beautiful life, there was a creeping coldness that was slowly freezing me out of my own marriage. It was a Saturday evening, and the air in our master suite was thick with an unspoken heavy tension. We were getting ready for the annual Jack and Jill Charity Gala. It was the most important social event of the season for Atlanta's elite. My mother-in-law Valerie was the president of the local chapter, and missing this event was simply not an option for her golden child son. I stood in front of the massive vanity mirror, smoothing down the heavy silk of my emerald green evening gown. Through the reflection, I watched Marcus struggling with his bow tie. His jaw was clenched tight. He had been deeply agitated all week, constantly buried in his phone, and snapping at me over the smallest inconveniences around the house. I genuinely thought he was just stressed about his investment fund. I thought I could help ease the heavy burden he was carrying. I stepped away from the mirror and walked over to him, gently swatting his hands away so I could tie the silk fabric for him. As I carefully adjusted his collar, I tried to bridge the emotional gap between us. I told him I had some amazing news about my business. I proudly explained that I had just secured the final zoning permits for a massive multi-million-dollar luxury development downtown. It was a project I had been pouring my absolute soul into for over 18 months. It was a massive, career-defining moment for me. I looked up into his eyes, waiting for the pride, waiting for the warm congratulations, waiting for my husband to simply share in my joy. Instead, Marcus let out a heavy, irritated sigh and took a step back, physically pulling away from my gentle touch. He looked down at his watch, completely ignoring the massive professional milestone I had just shared with him. He told me that we did not have time to discuss my little construction projects right now. He said his mother was expecting us to make a flawless entrance, and he needed me to focus entirely on the gala, not my personal ambitions. My hands dropped heavily to my sides. The dismissal felt like a physical blow straight to my chest. Little construction projects. That was exactly how he viewed the empire I was building from the ground up. He had completely forgotten that it was my so-called little projects that paid our expensive mortgage when his first investment firm went bankrupt 3 years ago. When he was drowning in debt and severe self-doubt, I was the one working 16-hour days to keep our lives afloat. I was the one who bought him the solid gold Rolex watch, currently resting on his wrist, a gift I purchased to celebrate his eventual comeback. I had carried us through the fire, but now that he was back on top, my hard-earned success was suddenly treated as a minor inconvenience. Before I could even find the words to tell him how much his callous dismissal hurt me, his phone vibrated loudly on the marble countertop. The screen lit up brightly with a name that had become a constant, agonizing thorn in my side. Jasmine. She was 33 years old, Marcus's childhood friend from their old church community, and the woman my mother-in-law constantly reminded me was the one that got away. Jasmine had spent her entire 20s chasing professional athletes and wealthy older men, completely ignoring Marcus, when he was just a struggling finance major trying to find his footing. But the minute Marcus started making real, substantial money and elevating his social status, she suddenly remembered their deep spiritual connection and inserted herself back into his life. The transformation in my husband was instantaneous and absolutely sickening to witness. The cold, agitated, dismissive man who had just insulted my life's work vanished completely. He snatched the phone from the bathroom counter and answered it on the very first ring. His voice dropped an octave, becoming warm, vibrant, and incredibly attentive. He laughed, a deep, genuine, and joyful sound that I had not heard directed at me in months. I stood frozen in the middle of our luxurious bedroom, watching my husband ask another woman about her day, with the exact level of interest and tender care I had just begged for moments ago. I stood silently as I heard him tell her how beautiful she was, undoubtedly going to look tonight. I heard him softly promise to save her a special dance at the gala. He paced the room, completely absorbed in her world, asking about her outfit and assuring her that he would personally make sure the valet took special care of her car when she arrived. He spoke to her with a gentleness and a devotion that made my stomach churn with severe nausea. I looked down at the expensive emerald silk of my gown, suddenly feeling entirely invisible and utterly worthless in my own home. I was his loyal wife, his partner, the woman who had built him back up from absolute nothing. But as I watched him smile so brightly at a voice through a speaker, a voice belonging to a woman who only wanted him now that he was a successful finished product, the harsh and painful reality settled over me. We were about to walk into a room full of Atlanta's highest society, pretending to be the perfect, untouchable Black power couple, while a toxic third person was already standing right between us. The drive to the St. Regis Hotel in Buckhead was suffocatingly quiet. Marcus drove his sleek black Porsche with tense, rigid movements, his eyes locked on the road ahead. I sat beside him in the passenger seat, watching the vibrant city lights of Atlanta blur past my window, feeling more like a captive audience member than a highly successful real estate developer heading to a major society event. We pulled up to the grand entrance, and the moment the valet opened my door, a terrifyingly seamless transformation took over my husband. The cold, irritable man from our bedroom instantly vanished. In his place stood Marcus the visionary, the charming and magnetic investment fund manager. He offered me his arm with the practiced camera-ready smile. I took it, matching his performance with my own polished grace, and together we stepped into the glittering heart of Black high society. The grand ballroom was an absolute spectacle of wealth and prestige. Crystal chandeliers cascaded from the vaulted ceilings, casting a warm golden glow over the sea of custom-tailored tuxedos and designer evening gowns. Jazz music floated through the air, mixing with the clinking of champagne glasses and the low hum of powerful people making lucrative deals disguised as casual conversation. This was my mother-in-law's kingdom, the annual Jack and Jill Charity Gala, where every handshake was calculated and every smile hid an agenda. Marcus navigated the room with effortless charisma, shaking hands with city council members and bank executives, introducing me as his beautiful wife, while completely omitting any mention of my recent multi-million-dollar commercial development deal. I played my part flawlessly, smiling and nodding, while an icy knot of dread tightened in my stomach. I knew she was here. I could feel her presence before I even saw her. Jasmine made her entrance like she was the guest of honor arriving at her own coronation. She wore a skin-tight crimson dress with a plunging neckline that brazenly defied the conservative elegance expected at this specific charity event. But Jasmine had never cared about rules, especially when it came to boundaries. She spotted us from across the room near the ice sculpture display, and her eyes locked onto Marcus like a predator locking onto its preferred prey. She did not walk toward us. She glided, parting the crowd with an arrogant confidence that made my blood boil. When she reached us, she did not even offer me a basic greeting. She stepped directly into Marcus's personal space, entirely too close for a married man and his so-called childhood friend. She reached out with her perfectly manicured hand and boldly adjusted the lapel of his tuxedo jacket. her fingers lingering against the fine fabric of his chest. She told him he looked absolutely breathtaking, her voice dropping into that familiar, sickeningly sweet register I had heard over the speakerphone just an hour earlier. Marcus practically glowed under her touch. He leaned into her attention, thanking her, and returning the compliment with an intensity that made several nearby couples turn their heads and exchange knowing, pitiful glances in my direction. The sheer disrespect was not just private anymore, it was becoming a public spectacle. Before I could firmly intervene and physically step between them, the crowd shifted. My mother-in-law, Valerie, appeared from the VIP section, her sharp eyes scanning the room. She beckoned to Marcus, loudly announcing that the mayor wanted a private word with him regarding a new community initiative. Marcus immediately excused himself, promising Jasmine he would be right back, and followed his mother toward the front of the ballroom. Suddenly, Jasmine and I were left completely alone near a tall cocktail table. The warm, inviting smile she had just flashed at my husband instantly melted away, replaced by a cold, calculating smirk that made her true intentions undeniably clear. She picked up a full crystal glass of icy martini from a passing waiter's tray. She took a slow, deliberate sip, looking me up and down with absolute contempt. She told me my green dress was cute, but it looked a little too stiff, a little too safe. I kept my posture perfectly straight, refusing to let her see how much her presence aggravated me. I told her that elegance often looks like restraint to people who do not understand it. Her eyes flashed with sudden, vicious anger. In one swift, entirely deliberate motion, she tilted her crystal glass forward. The freezing, sticky alcohol cascaded directly down the front of my expensive emerald silk gown. I gasped, stepping back as the cold liquid soaked instantly through the delicate fabric, leaving a massive, dark, undeniable stain right across my chest. It was not an accident. She did not trip. She did not stumble. She looked me dead in the eye as she ruined my dress in the middle of the most important social event of the year. I stood frozen, the shock of the cold alcohol seeping into my skin. I waited for the frantic apology, the fake gasp of horror, the theatrical performance of a clumsy mistake. But Jasmine did not even pretend. She took a step closer to me, leaning in so close I could smell the gin on her breath. She lowered her voice into a vicious, triumphant whisper. She told me I needed to stop pretending I was the queen of this castle. She looked directly into my eyes and said, "Marcus only married me because she was already married to someone else at the time." She stated with absolute arrogant certainty that I was nothing more than a placeholder, a safe, boring consolation prize for his waiting heart. She smiled a wicked, terrifying smile and whispered that he was just biding his time with me until she was ready to claim what was always meant to be hers. Any other woman might have burst into tears. Any other woman might have raised her voice, caused a massive scene, slapped the smug look right off her face, and given the wealthy gossips of Atlanta a scandal they would talk about for the next decade. But I did not cry. I did not scream. The sheer audacity of her delusion did not break me. It completely sobered me. I looked at this woman, this parasite who thought she had won a grand prize, and a terrifying sense of calm washed over my entire body. Right at that moment, Marcus returned from his conversation with the mayor. He saw the massive dark stain on my dress. He saw the empty glass in Jasmine's hand, and his reaction told me everything I would ever need to know about the true state of my marriage. He did not ask if I was okay. He did not demand to know what happened, or reprimand Jasmine for ruining my evening. Instead, he let out a loud, heavy sigh of pure exasperation. He looked at me with deep embarrassment, as if I had intentionally humiliated him by standing in the way of a spilled drink. He muttered that we could not take any press photos with me looking like a complete mess. He did not offer me his jacket to cover the stain. He did not offer to take me home. He simply raised his left arm, pulling back his cuff, to check the time, clearly calculating how quickly he could hide me away in a dark corner of the ballroom. As he raised his wrist, the heavy, brilliant gold of his Rolex watch caught the light of the crystal chandeliers above us. I stared down at the gleaming timepiece. I stared at the exact watch I had purchased for him 3 long, grueling years ago. The memory hit me with the force of a freight train. 3 years ago, Marcus was not shaking hands with mayors or wearing custom-tailored tuxedos. 3 years ago, his first investment fund had collapsed spectacularly. He was drowning in massive corporate debt, facing brutal lawsuits, and drinking himself to sleep on our living room sofa every single night. And where was Jasmine during that catastrophic downfall? Jasmine, his supposed soulmate, his childhood best friend, had immediately packed her designer bags and eloped with a minor league basketball player who had just signed a moderate contract. She ran toward easy money the second Marcus's bank accounts hit zero. While she was busy posting vacation photos from a luxury resort with another man, I was the one pulling Marcus out of the dark. I took on a brutal second job consulting for a rival real estate firm. I worked until my hands shook and my vision blurred, pouring every single dime of my own hard-earned money into paying off his angry creditors. I funded his therapy. I rebuilt his confidence brick by brick. And when he finally secured the seed money to start his new currently successful fund, I took my very first massive commission check and bought him that exact solid gold Rolex. I had it engraved on the back with a message about resilience. I bought it so he would look down at his wrist during intimidating board meetings and remember that he was worthy, that he was brilliant, and that he had a woman standing behind him who believed in his power when the rest of the world, including Jasmine, had completely abandoned him. I looked at that watch shining on his wrist now. He was using the very symbol of my extreme loyalty and financial sacrifice to time. How quickly he could dismiss me to protect his reputation in front of the woman who had left him for dead. The supreme irony of the situation did not break my heart. It ignited a cold, calculated fire in my soul. Jasmine truly believed I was a weak consolation prize because she measured a person's worth by how loudly they bragged and how much money they could extract from a man. She did not understand that I was not a passenger on Marcus's luxury cruise. I was the bank that owned the boat. I looked up from the gold watch, my eyes meeting Marcus's frustrated gaze, and then sliding over to Jasmine's triumphant, mocking smirk. I did not feel small anymore. I felt dangerous. I reached into my clutch, pulled out a silk handkerchief, and casually dabbed at the spilled liquor on my chest. I told Marcus he was absolutely right. I told him I looked like a mess, and I would quietly take a luxury rideshare back to our penthouse so he could stay and enjoy his important networking. I kept my voice perfectly smooth, entirely void of any anger or sorrow. Marcus looked instantly relieved, eagerly accepting my offer to disappear so he could continue entertaining his guest. Jasmine's smile widened fully, believing she had successfully bullied the wife out of the room. As I turned to walk away from the glittering ballroom, leaving my husband alone with his treacherous friend, I did not feel like a defeated woman retreating into the shadows. I felt like a general stepping off a battlefield to coordinate a massive airstrike. Jasmine wanted to claim the finished product I had built. She wanted to play house with the wealth and status I had personally funded. She thought she was the prize, but she had absolutely no idea that her own financial life was a fragile house of cards, and I was holding the match that was about to burn it straight to the ground. I walked out into the cool Atlanta night air, dialed my private wealth manager, and initiated the first step of a financial demolition that would leave them both begging for mercy. I stood under the grand portico of the St. Regis, the cool night air sending a violent shiver through my body as it hit the freezing alcohol-soaked fabric of my silk gown. I had my phone pressed firmly against my ear, listening to the dial tone, fully prepared to give my wealth manager the green light to initiate the financial strike. But before the call could even connect, the heavy brass and glass doors of the hotel lobby were pushed open with aggressive force. Marcus stormed out onto the cobblestone driveway, his face twisted in a deep, ugly scowl of absolute fury. He was not alone. Jasmine was clinging tightly to his arm, swaying dramatically on her designer heels, while my mother-in-law Valerie trailed closely behind them with a look of pure, refined, lethal judgment. Marcus marched directly up to me and snatched the phone out of my hand before the call could go through. He ended the call and shoved the device back into my clutch, his jaw clenched so tightly I could see a vein pulsing in his neck. He demanded to know what on earth I thought I was doing walking out of the most important networking event of the year. He kept his voice low to avoid drawing the attention of the valets, but the sheer venom in his tone was unmistakable. He told me I was acting like a petulant child throwing a temper tantrum. I stared at the man I had married, the man I had dragged out of financial ruin, and pointed to the massive reeking stain of gin spreading across my chest. I calmly stated that his supposed childhood friend had just intentionally poured a full cocktail over my evening gown after insulting our marriage, and I was quietly removing myself to avoid causing a public spectacle. Marcus let out a harsh, patronizing laugh that echoed against the stone pillars. He aggressively ran a hand over his face and told me to stop making a massive deal out of absolutely nothing. He insisted that Jasmine was simply intoxicated, that her heel had caught on the carpet, and that the spill was nothing more than a clumsy accident. He looked me dead in the eye and accused me of being completely paranoid. He said I was always trying to paint Jasmine as the villain because I was deeply, irrationally jealous of their long-standing history. The psychological manipulation was so blatant, so deeply ingrained in his defense of this toxic woman that it actually took my breath away. He was standing right in front of his wife, staring at the physical evidence of her public humiliation and actively choosing to protect the reputation of the woman who had caused it. Jasmine leaned heavily against Marcus's shoulder, playing her role of the helpless, innocent victim to absolute perfection. She let out a fake, trembling sigh and pouted her lips. She whined that she was so sorry and that she never meant to ruin my dress. She buried her face into my husband's tuxedo jacket and whispered that I was always so mean to her, that I constantly made her feel unwelcome in their sacred circle of friends. Marcus immediately wrapped his arm around her waist to steady her, shooting me a look of pure disgust. He told me I needed to swallow my irrational pride, go to the hotel bathroom, dry off my dress, and get back inside the ballroom before his prominent clients noticed my absence and started asking uncomfortable questions. Before I could firmly inform my husband that I would absolutely not be returning to that room. Valerie glided into the center of our circle. My mother-in-law was a woman who commanded fear and respect in equal measure. She was draped in an expensive white mink coat, her posture impeccably straight, her face a mask of aristocratic Atlanta high society. She did not look at the massive freezing wet stain on my dress. She did not ask if I was okay, or if I needed a coat to shield myself from the biting night air. Instead, her sharp eyes zeroed in on Jasmine. Valerie noticed a single solitary drop of moisture resting on Jasmine's wrist. With slow, deliberate movements, Valerie opened her vintage clutch and pulled out a custom-embroidered linen tissue. She completely bypassed me, stepped up to the woman who had just assaulted her daughter-in-law, and gently dabbed the tiny drop of moisture off Jasmine's skin. She spoke to Jasmine in a soft, soothing maternal tone, asking if the sticky alcohol was bothering her delicate skin. She handed the tissue to Jasmine to keep treating her with a level of tender, loving care that she had never not once extended to me in the entire history of my marriage to her son. The message was loud, clear, and absolutely undeniable. In Valerie's eyes, Jasmine was the true daughter of this family. I was just the hired help who happened to wear a wedding ring. Valerie then turned her icy, piercing gaze toward me. The maternal warmth vanished instantly, replaced by the chilling, authoritative tone of a matriarch about to deliver a severe reprimand. She told me to listen to her very carefully. She reminded me that the Dubois name was a pillar of the community, a shining, untouchable standard of Black excellence in the city of Atlanta. She said that generations of their family had worked tirelessly to build a legacy of power, grace, and unbreakable unity. She stepped closer to me, her voice dropping into a terrifyingly calm whisper. She told me that being a powerful Black woman in this society meant carrying a heavy crown, and part of carrying that crown meant swallowing my petty insecurities to protect the image of the Black man standing beside me. She weaponized my culture, my race, and my loyalty, all in one breath. She tried to frame my completely justified anger as a weakness that threatened to tear down their family empire. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger at my chest and told me that my real estate deals and my independent wealth meant absolutely nothing if I could not perform the basic duty of a supportive, resilient wife. She explicitly instructed me to stop acting like a fragile victim, to dry my tears, which I was not even crying, and to march back into that ballroom with a smile on my face. She said the media was inside waiting to take the annual family portrait, and she would not allow my emotional outburst to ruin the flawless image of their charitable foundation. I stood completely still, absorbing the sheer magnitude of their collective betrayal. This was not just Marcus failing to protect me. This was a systematic, deeply rooted family conspiracy to keep me in my place. They demanded my financial resources. They relied on my brilliant business acumen to elevate their status. They happily spent the money I generated to fund their lavish lifestyles. But they refused to grant me the basic human respect of defending me against a woman who actively wanted to destroy my marriage. They wanted the benefits of a highly successful, fiercely loyal wife, but they wanted to reserve their actual love and protection for a chaotic, manipulative woman who shared their long history. Jasmine peeked out from behind Marcus's shoulder. She looked right at me, and a wicked, triumphant smirk spread across her face. She knew exactly what was happening. She knew that Valerie and Marcus would always choose her over me. She thought she had won the ultimate victory. She thought she had successfully proven that I was entirely powerless in my own family dynamic. I looked at my husband, who was still holding another woman in his arms. I looked at my mother-in-law, who was demanding I sacrifice my dignity to protect her fake, glittering social image. I did not argue with them. I did not raise my voice or try to explain the basic concepts of respect and marital loyalty to people who were fundamentally incapable of understanding them. Arguing would only validate their twisted belief that I was being emotional and difficult. Instead, I gave them exactly what they wanted to see. I let my shoulders drop, softening my posture to appear submissive and defeated. I forced a polite, empty, perfectly compliant smile onto my face. I looked at Valerie and told her she was absolutely right. I apologized for overreacting. I told Marcus that the cold air had cleared my head and that I would happily go find the lobby restroom to clean myself up so we could take those important family photographs. The relief on their faces was immediate and deeply pathetic. Marcus let out a breath, releasing his tight grip on Jasmine. He told me he was glad I was finally thinking rationally. Valerie gave a curt approving nod, her posture relaxing now that the crisis had been successfully managed and the rebellious wife had been brought to heel. They immediately turned their backs on me, linking arms, as they guided Jasmine back toward the heavy brass doors of the hotel, eager to return to the warmth and the cameras of their precious high society gala. They walked away fully believing they had silenced me. They believed that the pressure of maintaining Black excellence and family loyalty had successfully forced me to accept my position at the bottom of their hierarchy. But as I watched the grand doors swing shut behind them, sealing them inside their fake glittering world, the compliant smile instantly vanished from my face. They thought they had forced me to swallow my pride, but they had actually just given me the ultimate, undeniable confirmation that this family was not worth saving. I reached back into my clutch and pulled out my phone. My hands were completely steady. My mind was sharper and colder than it had ever been in my entire life. I unlocked the screen, found the number for my private wealth manager, and pressed dial. The phone only rang twice before he answered. I did not hesitate. I did not second-guess myself. I gave him a single clear, devastating instruction. I told him to authorize the immediate acquisition of the mortgage debt attached to Jasmine's estate, and to prepare the foreclosure paperwork for aggressive, immediate execution. The time for being a supportive, resilient wife was officially over. The demolition was a go. 3 days passed since the gala. I played my part flawlessly. I smiled over morning coffee, asked Marcus about his investment meetings, and maintained the polished, unbothered facade of a woman who had simply moved past a minor social misunderstanding. I did not bring up the ruined emerald dress. I did not mention his mother's chilling reprimand in the courtyard. I went to my office in downtown Atlanta, locked my door, and quietly finalized the massive mountain of legal paperwork that would soon render his childhood best friend entirely homeless. The financial gears were turning rapidly in the background, but inside our penthouse, the atmosphere was a masterclass in silent psychological warfare. On Wednesday evening, I stepped out of our private elevator and into the foyer of our home. I had just spent 10 grueling hours at a construction site negotiating with contractors and city officials. I was tired, my feet ached, and I was looking forward to a quiet glass of wine on my balcony. But the heavy, unmistakable scent of baked barbecue ribs, roasted garlic, and candied yams hit me before I even rounded the corner into the living space. I walked into my custom-designed imported Italian marble kitchen and stopped dead in my tracks. Jasmine was standing at my six-burner stove. She was wearing my personalized linen apron over her tight designer jeans. She was humming a cheerful gospel song, swaying her hips back and forth, acting with the absolute comfort of a woman who had lived in this multi-million-dollar penthouse her entire life. She had taken it upon herself to completely rearrange my countertops. My expensive, imported spices had been shoved to the back of the pantry to make room for her generic store-bought seasonings. My premium cookware was scattered across the island, and a sticky ring of barbecue sauce was slowly drying into the pristine white marble I had personally sourced from Florence. Jasmine heard my heels click against the floor and turned around. She did not look startled or apologetic. She flashed me a bright, deeply condescending smile. She casually wiped her hands on my apron and told me that Marcus had given her the security code to our private elevator. She said she hoped I did not mind her dropping by unannounced, claiming she just wanted to do something nice for us, since we both worked such demanding hours. I set my leather briefcase down on the dining table. I did not raise my voice. I did not demand she take off my apron or ask for my security code back. I simply walked over to the wine fridge, pulled out a bottle of Pinot Noir, and poured myself a generous glass. I leaned against the counter, taking a slow sip, and watched her operate in my territory. Jasmine took my silence as a sign of submission. Emboldened, she leaned against the kitchen island, mirroring my posture but invading my space. She lowered her voice, adopting that fake nurturing tone she loved to use whenever she wanted to highlight my supposed flaws as a wife. She told me that Marcus had called her late last night after I had gone to sleep. She sighed heavily, shaking her head with manufactured pity. She said he sounded so exhausted, so drained by the pressures of his career. Jasmine looked around my immaculate, beautifully decorated kitchen and clicked her tongue. She boldly stated that Marcus had been confiding in her about the deep, chilling emptiness he felt in his marriage. She whispered that a powerful black man like Marcus needed a sanctuary, a place filled with warmth and traditional home-cooked meals, not just a cold architectural showpiece managed by a woman who only cared about construction permits and corporate bank accounts. She looked me directly in the eyes and said, "It must be so incredibly hard for him to come home to a woman who lacked the natural nurturing instincts required to truly take care of a husband." The sheer audacity of her monologue was breathtaking. She was standing in a penthouse paid for by my real estate empire, cooking food on a stove I purchased, warning me that my husband found my financial ambition unappealing. Any other woman would have dragged her out of the apartment by her hair. But as I stood there swirling the red wine in my crystal glass, I did not feel threatened by her domestic performance. I felt an overwhelming sense of clinical fascination. I let my gaze drift from her smug face down to the designer handbag she had casually tossed onto my breakfast nook. It was a classic Chanel flap bag, an undeniable status symbol in our social circles. But my trained eye noticed the subtle details. The leather was visibly scuffed at the bottom corners. The gold hardware was losing its shine. It was an expensive accessory that belonged to a woman desperately trying to project a wealth she could no longer afford to maintain. I knew the truth hiding behind her arrogant smile. I knew her bank accounts were bleeding dry. I knew she was drowning in insurmountable debt. I knew exactly what time my wealth manager had executed the transfer of her mortgage that very morning. I was literally the owner of the roof over her head, and she was standing in my kitchen wearing my apron, entirely oblivious to her impending doom. I gave her a soft, polite smile. I told her the ribs smelled absolutely delightful and thanked her for going out of her way to help feed my husband while I was busy funding our lifestyle. Jasmine's smirk faltered for just a fraction of a second, her brain struggling to process my total lack of jealousy or outrage. Before she could formulate a venomous reply, the front door chimed. Marcus walked into the penthouse, loosening his silk tie and shrugging off his suit jacket. The moment the smell of the barbecue hit him, his tense posture completely relaxed. He walked into the kitchen, saw Jasmine standing by the stove with a plate of hot food, and his entire face lit up with a blinding, joyful radiance. He wrapped his arms around her in a tight, familiar hug, completely ignoring the fact that I was standing less than 3 feet away. He closed his eyes, inhaled the scent of the food, and loudly proclaimed that she was an absolute lifesaver. Marcus turned to me, his smile dropping slightly as he gestured to the feast Jasmine had laid out on our dining table. He did not thank me for working all day. He did not ask how my multi-million-dollar zoning meeting went. He simply looked at the ribs, looked back at me, and stated that this was exactly what he needed. He boldly proclaimed that a hot home-cooked meal was the true definition of making a house feel like a home, delivering a sharp, undeniable dig at my busy schedule and my supposed lack of traditional domestic skills. We sat down at the dining table. Marcus insisted Jasmine stay and eat with us, pulling out the chair right next to his. I sat across from them, taking my time cutting into the meat on my plate. I watched the two of them interact. I watched them laugh at inside jokes from their childhood. I watched Jasmine serve him extra portions and refill his glass before he even had to ask. I sat there in the suffocating heavy atmosphere of my own dining room, treating the entire dinner like a fascinating sociological study rather than a devastating heartbreak. The food was mediocre at best. The meat was dry and the seasoning was heavily overcompensated with cheap salt. But Marcus ate it like it was a masterpiece prepared by a culinary genius. He was eating up the performance, entirely captivated by the illusion of the perfect subservient woman who demanded nothing from him but his presence. I took a slow, deliberate bite of the food, chewed quietly, and smiled. I let them have their grand domestic fantasy. I let them believe they had successfully pushed me into a corner of my own home. They were happily celebrating their little victory over dinner, completely unaware that the countdown to their absolute destruction had officially begun. The moment the private elevator doors slid shut behind Jasmine, the heavy silence in our penthouse shattered. Marcus did not even wait for the indicator light to show she had reached the lobby before he turned on me. The joyful, relaxed demeanor he had paraded around the kitchen instantly evaporated, replaced by a rigid posture and a deeply resentful glare. He crossed his arms over his chest and let out a sharp breath, shaking his head as if he were dealing with a deeply disappointing subordinate rather than his wife. He accused me of being completely intolerable. He said my silence during dinner was not just rude but actively hostile, and that I had deliberately tried to make his oldest friend feel unwelcome in our home. I stood by the sink, calmly loading the dirty plates into the dishwasher, refusing to give him the explosive argument he was desperately baiting me into. My composed silence only infuriated him further. Marcus stepped closer, his voice rising as he began to lecture me on the intricacies of social grace and tactical networking. He told me that I completely lacked the essential tact required to maintain a high society household. He stated that I was so consumed by my real estate deals and my own rigid ambition that I had forgotten how to nurture basic relationships. He pointed a finger at me and boldly declared that being part of a prominent Black power couple meant creating an inviting, warm environment for allies, not freezing people out because of my own deeply rooted insecurities. He leaned against the marble island, looking at me with pure condescension. He told me I could learn a lot from Jasmine about how to foster a supportive atmosphere. He said Jasmine understood the heavy burden he carried as an investment fund manager and knew exactly how to alleviate that stress, whereas I only ever added to his mental load with my endless talk of construction permits and property acquisitions. He looked his fiercely loyal, financially independent wife dead in the eye and told me I was failing at the most fundamental duties of a supportive partner. I did not raise my voice in my own defense. I simply closed the dishwasher, wiped down the counter where his friend had left a sticky mess, and walked out of the kitchen. I let him stand there entirely convinced he had won the argument while I went to sleep, knowing I held the legal paperwork that would soon render him and his beloved friend completely defenseless. The psychological warfare escalated the very next morning. I was sitting at the expansive mahogany desk in my downtown office, reviewing the structural blueprints for my latest commercial development when my private line rang. The caller ID displayed my mother-in-law's name. I took a slow, measured breath and answered the call, knowing exactly what kind of conversation was about to unfold. Valerie did not bother with pleasantries or basic morning greetings. She launched directly into a stern, authoritative lecture. She informed me that Marcus had called her late last night, deeply distressed by my incredibly poor behavior during dinner. Valerie's tone was sharp and imperious, dripping with the absolute certainty of a matriarch who believed her word was undeniable law. She told me I needed to immediately drop my hostile, jealous attitude toward Jasmine, before I could even point out the supreme hypocrisy of her defending a woman who had publicly ruined my dress. Valerie dropped a massive piece of information that made my blood run cold. She commanded me to stay completely out of Jasmine's way, because Jasmine was currently serving as the critical bridge to a monumental financial opportunity. Valerie proudly revealed that Jasmine was brokering a private introduction between Marcus and a major, highly elusive venture capitalist she had allegedly met through her elite church network. Valerie spoke with breathless arrogance. She claimed this mysterious investor was preparing to inject millions of dollars into Marcus's new investment fund, a deal that would instantly catapult the Dubois family name into the upper echelons of global finance. She weaponized the concept of family duty, telling me that I should be on my knees thanking Jasmine for facilitating this connection. She sneered through the phone, stating that while I was busy playing in the dirt with my little construction sites, Jasmine was out there actively building my husband's generational wealth. Valerie delivered her final chilling ultimatum. She strictly forbade me from interfering with this business relationship. She warned me that if my petty selfish pride ruined this multi-million-dollar deal, the entire family would hold me personally responsible for destroying Marcus's legacy. She hung up the phone before I could say a single word. I slowly lowered the receiver, placing it back on my desk. I leaned back in my leather executive chair and stared out the massive windows at the Atlanta skyline. A strange, chilling sense of clarity washed over my mind as I began to mentally dissect the absurd narrative my mother-in-law had just proudly delivered. Something was fundamentally dangerously wrong. I picked up my encrypted tablet and logged directly into my secure financial database. I am a luxury real estate developer who routinely handles nine-figure property acquisitions. I have unrestricted access to elite financial analysts' background check software and corporate registries. I pulled up the heavily guarded file I had compiled on Jasmine's financial status. I stared at the brutal, undeniable numbers glaring back at me from the glowing screen. Jasmine was entirely bankrupt. I literally held the foreclosure paperwork for her heavily mortgaged mansion in my own secure briefcase. Her luxury vehicles were leased and 3 months behind on payments. Her designer credit cards were maxed out beyond their limits. Her entire life was a meticulously crafted, crumbling illusion. I thought about the scuffed corners of her Chanel bag resting on my kitchen counter the night before. I thought about the desperate, clinging way she looked at Marcus. The mathematics of the situation simply did not add up. Ultra-wealthy, highly elusive venture capitalists do not take financial counsel from women who cannot afford to pay their basic utility bills. Billionaires do not trust their massive portfolios to social climbers drowning in toxic debt. Jasmine did not have access to any legitimate investors. I began typing rapidly, running deep corporate searches on the supposed investment firm Valerie had mentioned. It took me less than 30 minutes to cut through the smoke and mirrors. The company Jasmine was allegedly connecting Marcus to had no physical footprint. It was registered to a small, obscure P.O. box in Delaware. There were no prominent board members, no history of successful mergers, and absolutely no digital trace of the massive capital Valerie had bragged about. It was a ghost. It was a brilliantly disguised shell company. The terrifying reality of the situation clicked into place with absolute precision. This was not just a pathetic emotional affair. This was a highly calculated, catastrophic financial trap. Jasmine was not bringing Marcus a life-changing investment. She was setting him up to take the fall for a massive fraud. She was financially drowning, and she had targeted my husband because she knew his desperation to prove himself to his mother made him an incredibly easy mark. She was planning to funnel money out of Marcus's legitimate fund into her fake shell company, leaving Marcus holding the bag when the federal authorities inevitably came knocking. She was using his blind, arrogant trust against him. She was actively constructing a scenario where Marcus would sign his name on fraudulent corporate documents, legally binding himself to her massive web of debt. And the most tragic, pathetic part of it all was that Marcus and Valerie were willingly marching right into the slaughterhouse, aggressively pushing away the only woman who possessed the financial firepower to actually save them. They were so blinded by their desperate need to maintain their fake image of black excellence that they were handing the keys to their empire directly to a parasite. I locked my tablet and slid it back into my desk drawer. I did not pick up the phone to warn my husband. I did not call my mother-in-law to expose the fraud. They had made it abundantly clear that my voice held no value in their sacred family circle. They had demanded that I sit back and watch Jasmine operate. So that is exactly what I was going to do. I was going to give them exactly what they asked for. I was going to let Marcus sign whatever documents Jasmine put in front of him. I was going to let them build their beautiful, fraudulent house of cards as high as they possibly could. I would not interrupt their grand illusion. I would simply wait in the shadows, gathering every single piece of explosive evidence I needed, ensuring that when the entire structure finally collapsed, I would be the only one left standing completely untouched in the wreckage. The very next Sunday, I found myself sitting on the pristine white linen sofas of my mother-in-law's sprawling sunroom in Buckhead. Valerie hosted an exclusive afternoon tea on the last weekend of every month. It was a highly curated, deeply pretentious display of wealth. The room was filled with imported Earl Grey tiered silver trays of cucumber sandwiches and a guest list strictly limited to the women she deemed worthy of associating with the Dubois name. Naturally, Jasmine was seated right next to Valerie on the velvet love seat, sipping her tea with an air of absolute entitlement. I sat across from them, maintaining my perfect posture and an entirely unbothered, polite smile. Sitting directly beside me, looking visibly uncomfortable in the suffocating atmosphere, was Chloe. Chloe was 29 years old, a brilliant forensic accountant, and the wife of Marcus's older brother Jamal. She was also a white woman, which in Valerie's fiercely guarded elitist circle made her an immediate target for endless passive-aggressive torment. Valerie had never approved of Jamal marrying outside their specific social network and race. She viewed Chloe not as a loving daughter-in-law, but as a cultural and social misstep that needed to be managed, minimized, and hidden away at all costs. Valerie spent the first hour of the tea party completely ignoring Chloe's presence. Whenever Chloe attempted to join the conversation, whether it was to compliment the elaborate floral arrangements or ask a polite question about the community, Valerie would simply turn her head and ask Jasmine about her mother's recent trip to Paris. Jasmine, absolutely reveling in her favored status, eagerly played along with the exclusion. She leaned across the low glass table, offering Valerie a plate of lemon scones while deliberately bumping her elbow hard against Chloe's teacup. Chloe had to awkwardly snatch her cup with both hands to avoid spilling hot tea all over her lap. Jasmine did not apologize. Instead, she let out a short, high-pitched, deeply condescending laugh. Jasmine then set her sights directly on Chloe's outfit. She looked at Chloe's sensible, tailored navy blue suit and smirked. She loudly remarked that it was so incredibly brave of Chloe to show up to a high-society Atlanta tea party wearing something that looked like it was pulled straight off a discount clearance rack. Valerie chuckled softly behind her porcelain cup, taking another sip of her tea, actively endorsing and encouraging the blatant bullying. Jasmine turned her full attention to Valerie, loudly proclaiming that some women simply do not possess the innate grace, the cultural background, and the refined elegance required to truly fit into a powerful family like the Dubois. She cast a deliberate, wicked side-eye at me as she said it, clearly attempting to hit two unwanted daughters-in-law with one single stone. I set my antique teacup down on its matching saucer. I made sure the porcelain hit with a sharp, definitive clink that instantly cut through their toxic, mocking laughter. I looked directly into Jasmine's eyes with a warm, deadly, and completely fearless smile. I told her that true elegance was never about the flashy price tag on a dress, but about the substance and character of the woman wearing it. I calmly pointed out that Chloe's suit was actually a vintage, custom-tailored piece from a highly respected European design house. I explained that it highlighted a level of quiet old-money sophistication that loud, desperate, heavily branded clothing could never possibly replicate. I did not stop there. I turned my full attention to Valerie, keeping my voice perfectly respectful, but laced with an undeniable heavy authority. I reminded my mother-in-law that Chloe was not just a beautiful addition to their family, but a fiercely intelligent forensic accountant. I stated that her brilliant financial mind was exactly the kind of asset a powerful dynasty desperately needed in today's economy. I casually mentioned how incredibly lucky Jamal was to have a wife who could actually read a complex corporate balance sheet and spot financial fraud from a mile away. I kept my eyes locked on Jasmine as I delivered my final precise strike. I said it was a blessing to have a woman like Chloe in the family, unlike some women who merely pretended to understand wealth while secretly drowning in massive, insurmountable debt. Jasmine's smug smile instantly vanished from her face. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving her looking entirely pale and terrified. The specific mention of spotting financial fraud and drowning in debt hit her exactly where I intended. She knew her own bank accounts were bleeding dry. She knew her luxury lifestyle was a complete illusion. For a terrifying, breathless second, she looked at me and wondered if I actually knew the dark truth about her upcoming shell company scam. Valerie, completely oblivious to the severe financial reality of her favorite guest, simply cleared her throat and hastily changed the subject to the upcoming church fundraiser. The direct assault on Chloe was immediately and permanently shut down. As Valerie and Jasmine anxiously busied themselves with their new safer topic of conversation, I felt a gentle, deliberate tap against my shoe under the glass coffee table. I looked beside me. Chloe was looking down at her lap, a small, genuine smile playing on her lips. She slowly lifted her gaze to meet mine. In her bright eyes, I saw absolute crystal-clear comprehension. She saw exactly what Valerie and Jasmine were. She saw the grand hypocrisy, the deep toxicity, and the ridiculous illusion they were constantly projecting. More importantly, she saw me. She recognized that I had just drawn a firm protective line in the sand for her. After the suffocating tea party finally concluded, we stood outside under the massive portico waiting for the valets to bring our cars around to the front driveway. Chloe stepped up close beside me. She did not offer a dramatic, tearful display of gratitude. She was a professional, highly analytical woman who communicated with sharp precision. She simply adjusted the strap of her leather handbag, looked straight ahead at the manicured lawn, and murmured that it was fascinating how the loudest people in the room usually had the absolute most to hide. I nodded in slow agreement, stating that empty vessels always make the most noise. We exchanged a single, deeply knowing look before our respective cars pulled up to the curb. No formal alliance was spoken aloud. We did not shake hands or sign a treaty. But a powerful, unbreakable, and entirely secret bond had just been forged in the fire of Valerie's toxic household. Two brilliant women, entirely underestimated and deeply despised by the Dubois family, had just silently agreed to watch each other's backs. Jasmine thought she was running a flawless con on my husband, but she had just made a fatal miscalculation. She was now trapped in a family with a ruthless real estate mogul and a forensic accountant, two women uniquely qualified to dismantle her entire fraudulent life, piece by piece. Before Chloe and I had shared that silent and knowing look on the cobblestone driveway, the true foundation of our alliance was cemented in the chaotic aftermath of a perfectly executed distraction right inside Valerie's opulent sunroom. The heavy tension from my verbal takedown of Jasmine had barely settled into the room when Chloe decided it was her turn to strike. Jasmine had placed her allegedly exclusive limited edition Hermes Birkin bag right on the edge of the glass coffee table, treating the leather accessory like a holy relic for everyone to admire and envy. She kept resting her hand on it, ensuring the gold hardware caught the afternoon sunlight, a constant physical reminder of her supposed wealth and untouchable status. Chloe reached across the wide glass table to grab a sugar cube for her tea. Her movement was swift, precise, and flawlessly disguised as a clumsy accident. Her forearm deliberately caught the ornate handle of the heavy silver teapot resting near the center tray. A steaming, scalding cascade of dark Earl Grey tea splashed directly across the table, flying through the air and landing squarely on the pristine leather of Jasmine's prized possession. Jasmine let out a high, piercing shriek of pure, unadulterated panic. She leaped up from the velvet loveseat so fast she nearly knocked over her own teacup, frantically grabbing at the stained, dripping leather of her bag. Valerie immediately began to fuss, gasping in horror and calling out for the housekeeper, treating the minor tea spill like a catastrophic national emergency. Jasmine glared at Chloe with absolute venom, ready to unleash a torrent of insults, but I did not waste a single second. I stepped right into the center of the chaos, seamlessly playing the role of the calm, helpful, and highly sophisticated daughter-in-law. I firmly took the ruined bag from Jasmine's trembling hands, ignoring her protests. I announced with absolute authority that I knew exactly how to treat and restore luxury leather before the dark tea stain could permanently set into the grain. I told them I was taking it straight to the powder room to clean it immediately. Chloe, playing the role of the mortified and clumsy guest to absolute perfection, immediately volunteered to assist me. She profusely apologized to a hyperventilating Jasmine while quickly and quietly following me down the long carpeted hallway. The moment the heavy solid oak door of the powder room clicked shut and the brass lock securely engaged, the frantic apologetic energy entirely vanished from the air. Chloe did not reach for a hand towel. She did not even look at the tea-stained Hermes bag resting on the expansive marble vanity. She calmly turned on the gold faucet to its maximum pressure, creating a loud barrier of rushing white noise against anyone who might be trying to listen at the door. Then she turned to face me. Her mild, uncomfortable, submissive demeanor was completely gone. The woman standing in front of me was no longer the bullied, out-of-place daughter-in-law. In her place stood a razor-sharp, highly trained, and fiercely intelligent financial investigator. Chloe reached into the tailored pocket of her navy blue suit and pulled out a sleek black USB drive. She did not hesitate or second-guess herself. She reached out and pressed the small, heavy device firmly into the palm of my hand, closing my fingers over it. Her bright eyes locked onto mine, burning with an intense, calculating energy that demanded absolute attention. She kept her voice extremely low, speaking with the rapid, clinical precision of a woman who dissected complex corporate fraud for a living. She told me she knew exactly what I was thinking, and exactly what I was quietly planning to do. She said she had been silently watching Jasmine circle my husband for months, using Valerie's elitist vanity and desperate need for social validation to infiltrate the family business. Chloe stated that while Valerie and Marcus were completely blinded by Jasmine's carefully curated social media presence and her arrogant bragging at Sunday dinners, cold hard numbers simply did not lie. Chloe had taken it upon herself to use her professional resources to dig deep into the public records, tax filings, and corporate registries associated with Jasmine and her supposedly ultra-wealthy husband. Chloe revealed the devastating truth with surgical precision. Jasmine's husband was not a highly successful entrepreneur or a brilliant market disruptor. He was a complete and utter financial failure. His primary business ventures had quietly filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy over 2 years ago. Chloe explained that Jasmine and her husband were currently drowning in severe, suffocating debt. They were aggressively dodging creditors, hiding assets, and fighting off multiple vicious lawsuits for unpaid corporate loans. The designer clothes, the luxury cars, the lavish vacations. Valerie constantly praised. It was all funded by predatory credit lines and high-interest loans that were mere days away from entirely collapsing. Jasmine was a walking financial corpse playing dress-up. Then Chloe dropped the final, most devastating piece of the puzzle. She pointed to the black USB drive resting tightly in my hand. She told me that the drive contained heavily encrypted, undeniable forensic proof regarding the massive elite investor Jasmine was currently brokering for Marcus's new investment fund. Chloe had meticulously traced the corporate registration of this mysterious venture capitalist all the way down the rabbit hole. She confirmed my exact chilling suspicions. There was no billionaire investor. There was no legitimate private equity firm looking to partner with Marcus. It was a brilliantly constructed, highly illegal shell company. It was registered to a fake address in a tax haven state, designed specifically to siphon massive amounts of capital directly out of Marcus's legitimate accounts and straight into a black hole of offshore banking controlled by Jasmine's creditors. Jasmine was not trying to help Marcus build his generational wealth or elevate the Dubois family legacy. She was setting him up to be the undisputed, legally bound fall guy for a multi-million-dollar federal fraud case. She was going to use his signature, his legitimate investment fund, and his arrogant desperation to please his mother to save herself from complete financial ruin. and she was doing it right under Valerie's approving watchful eye, using their shared history and church connections as the ultimate smokescreen. I stood in the marble powder room, gripping the small plastic drive so tightly the edges bit sharply into my skin. Every single suspicion, every cold calculation I had made, while staring out the window of my downtown office, was now backed by hard, irrefutable forensic evidence. Chloe had just handed me the exact undeniable ammunition I needed to absolutely obliterate Jasmine's entire existence. I looked at Chloe, this quiet, unassuming woman who had been relentlessly mocked and sidelined by my mother-in-law for not fitting their toxic, narrow definition of perfection. I asked her why she was giving this explosive information directly to me instead of taking it to her own husband Jamal or bringing it straight to Marcus to warn him. Chloe gave a short, bitter, knowing laugh. She looked at her reflection in the mirror and said, "The Dubois men were far too incredibly prideful to ever admit they were being played, especially by a woman they thought they thoroughly understood and controlled." She knew that if she brought this evidence to the family, Valerie would immediately bury the files and destroy the drive just to protect their social standing from the embarrassment of a scandal. Marcus would somehow find a way to blame the glaring financial discrepancies on a banking error rather than accept that his beloved childhood best friend was a criminal parasite trying to destroy his life. Chloe looked back at me with absolute unwavering respect. She said I was the only person in this entire family with the actual power, the independent wealth, and the sheer, unyielding ruthlessness required to handle the situation correctly. She knew I would not sweep it under the rug to save face. She knew I would take the evidence and burn the threat straight to the ground. I slipped the USB drive safely into the hidden pocket of my dress, securing the weapon that would win the war. I grabbed a soft white hand towel, ran it under the warm water of the faucet, and began casually wiping down the damp leather of Jasmine's bag. I looked at Chloe and told her that she was absolutely right. I thanked her for her brilliant forensic work and promised her that when the inevitable explosion finally happened, she and Jamal would be entirely shielded from the devastating fallout. I assured her that the Dubois family would soon learn the severe consequences of underestimating the women they brought into their home. We unlocked the powder room door and walked back out into the bright, suffocating atmosphere of the sunroom. I handed the perfectly cleaned, mostly undamaged bag back to a still panicked and frantic Jasmine. I smiled warmly at her, playing my role flawlessly. She snatched the bag from my hands with a huff of annoyance, completely oblivious to the massive, terrifying reality of what had just transpired. She was holding onto a fake status symbol, entirely unaware that the two women she had just spent an hour mocking had successfully secured the key to her absolute destruction. Beneath the surface of that elegant tea party, a lethal, inescapable trap had just been locked into place. That night, the heavy silence of our penthouse felt like the calm before a devastating hurricane. Marcus was out late, allegedly celebrating the imminent closing of the new investment deal over expensive scotch at an exclusive downtown steakhouse with Jasmine and her phantom financial representative. His absence gave me the exact window of solitude I needed. I walked into my private home office, locked the heavy double doors, and pulled the blinds over the sweeping views of the Atlanta skyline. I sat down at my desk, booted up an air-gapped laptop with no connection to the internet, and inserted the black USB drive Chloe had pressed into my palm hours earlier. The drive loaded, instantly revealing a flawlessly organized digital archive created with the clinical precision of a top-tier forensic accountant. Chloe had not merely dumped raw documents onto the drive. She had constructed a comprehensive color-coded financial roadmap that meticulously tracked every dollar, every fake invoice, and every shell corporation tied to Jasmine and her husband over the past 3 years. Attached to the root folder was an encrypted text file containing a direct, secure line of communication to Chloe. I opened the messaging portal on my secure phone, typed a quick confirmation that I was inside the system, and immediately received a response from my sister-in-law. She was awake, vigilant, and ready to guide me through the dark labyrinth of Jasmine's financial crimes. I started by opening the primary folder labeled Charity Operations. What I uncovered within the first 20 minutes of reading made my stomach drop and my blood run cold. For years, my mother-in-law Valerie had proudly served as the board president and primary trustee of the Grace and Legacy Foundation, a highly publicized tax-exempt charitable organization affiliated with their historic church. The foundation was Valerie's absolute pride and joy, the crown jewel of her social standing in Atlanta, funded by millions of dollars in donations from wealthy Black families, local businesses, and corporate sponsors. Because Valerie held absolute unquestioned authority over the board, she had personally appointed Jasmine as the foundation's special financial consultant, trusting her implicitly based on their shared history. Jasmine had weaponized that blind, arrogant trust to commit a catastrophic crime. According to the bank statements and wire transfer logs Chloe had unearthed through court filings and public database tracking, Jasmine had been systematically embezzling money directly out of the foundation's primary endowment account for over 18 months. She had created a network of 3 separate fake vendor accounts disguised as event management agencies, floral designers, and community outreach programs. Every single month, Jasmine approved massive invoice payouts to these phantom companies. The funds were then instantly routed through a series of offshore accounts before landing directly in Jasmine's personal accounts to pay off her mounting credit card debts, her luxury car leases. The total amount stolen from the church foundation exceeded $2.4 million. It was a massive, sickening crime that carried severe federal prison time. Jasmine was not just drowning in personal debt. She was actively sitting on a ticking financial time bomb that was guaranteed to explode the moment the foundation underwent its mandatory biannual audit. Valerie had blindly signed off on every single fraudulent report Jasmine placed in front of her, completely unaware that her beloved favorite girl was quietly destroying her life's work and setting her up for a devastating public scandal that would ruin the Dubois family name forever. I rubbed my temples, staring at the glowing screen in utter disbelief. But as disturbing as the charity embezzlement was, the second folder on the drive labeled Investment Fund Indemnity contained the true sinister core of Jasmine's master plan. This was the folder detailing the exact investment deal Jasmine was currently pushing Marcus to sign. I opened the draft contract, scrolling past the lofty, flowery promises of offshore venture capital, and went straight to the fine print buried deep within the legal riders on page 64. There, hidden beneath convoluted corporate jargon and deceptive cross-collateralization clauses, was the trap Jasmine had set for my husband. The contract was structured so that the Delaware Shell Company would not actually be injecting new capital into Marcus's investment fund. Instead, the agreement executed a complete merger of liabilities between the Shell Company and Marcus's firm. Under the terms of the rider, the moment Marcus signed his name and accepted the preliminary transaction, his fund legally assumed full responsibility for all existing debts, outstanding loans, and legal claims tied to the Shell Company and its designated officers. The chilling reality of her scheme hit me with absolute crystal clarity. Jasmine knew the federal auditors were closing in on the church foundation's missing millions. She knew her personal creditors were preparing to seize her assets. So she constructed this fake investment opportunity to execute the ultimate corporate transfer of guilt. By tricking Marcus into signing this contract, Jasmine was transferring her entire $2.4 million embezzlement debt, along with her personal liabilities, directly onto Marcus's balance sheet. When the federal authorities inevitably discovered the stolen money, the paper trail created by the contract would show that the funds from the church foundation had been funneled straight into Marcus's firm under the guise of an investment partnership. Jasmine would walk away completely clean, claiming she was merely a broker, while Marcus would be left standing as the sole legal guarantor and primary suspect in a massive federal wire fraud case. She was not just trying to steal his money or destroy our marriage. She was actively setting up my husband to serve a decade in a federal penitentiary so she could escape the consequences of her own criminal greed. I leaned back in my chair, my heart pounding violently against my ribs. I looked at the encrypted phone on my desk as a message from Chloe popped up on the screen. She asked if I had reached page 64 yet. I typed back a single word, yes. Chloe immediately responded, confirming that the legal traps were ironclad. If Marcus signed that document, no attorney in the state of Georgia would be able to untangle him from Jasmine's crimes. He would be ruined financially, professionally, and legally within 24 hours of the closing date. Any ordinary wife, upon discovering that her husband was about to be destroyed by a treacherous snake, would have panicked. She would have called him immediately, screamed at him to come home, thrown the documents in his face, and begged him to cancel the deal. But as I sat in the dim light of my office holding the power to save him, I remembered his arrogant, cruel voice from the kitchen table. I remembered him telling me that I lacked grace, that I was a cold, unsupportive wife, and that I should learn domestic devotion from Jasmine. I remembered Valerie telling me that I meant nothing compared to the glorious Dubois legacy. A cold, beautiful, and utterly ruthless smile spread across my face. Warning Marcus would only lead to denial. He was so deeply blinded by his own massive ego and his mother's endless praise that he would accuse me of fabricating the evidence out of jealousy. He would run straight to Jasmine, show her the leak, and allow her time to cover her tracks, or rewrite the trap. I was not going to give them that chance. I picked up the secure phone and called Chloe directly. When she answered, I told her to finalize the forensic audit report, print out physical certified hard copies, and place them in a sealed leather binder. I told her we were going to let the deal proceed to its absolute climax. We would let Marcus hold his pen over the signature line at the upcoming 10th anniversary gala for Valerie's foundation. We would let Jasmine believe she had successfully executed the heist of the century. And right at the moment of their ultimate arrogant triumph, in front of every prominent figure in Atlanta high society, we would pull the curtain back and destroy them all at once. Chloe let out a quiet, satisfied laugh over the line and agreed. The stage was set, the evidence was locked, and the countdown to Judgment Night was officially ticking. I did not sleep that night. I sat at the massive desk in my home office watching the sunrise slowly paint the Atlanta skyline in brilliant shades of gold and crimson. The morning light hitting the glass skyscrapers served as a sharp reminder of exactly who I was and the empire I had built. I was not a helpless housewife waiting to be rescued, and I certainly was not a woman who could be easily replaced by a childhood friend wearing a cheap mask of domestic devotion. I was a kingmaker in this city, and it was time to deploy the full terrifying weight of my resources. By 8 o'clock in the morning, I stepped out of my private elevator and directly into the executive suite of my commercial real estate development firm. I instructed my assistant to hold all my incoming calls, cancel my site visits for the entire day, and bring me a double espresso. I had a very specific, highly classified financial acquisition to execute, and it required my absolute undivided attention. Jasmine lived in a sprawling, ostentatious mansion in the affluent suburb of Sandy Springs. It was a massive, heavily customized estate with towering white columns and a sweeping circular driveway that she constantly showed off on her social media accounts to project an image of untouchable wealth. But thanks to the flawless forensic digging provided by Chloe, I knew the ugly, rotting reality hiding behind that pristine stucco facade. Jasmine and her bankrupt husband had financed the property using a desperate web of high-interest predatory loans. They had taken out a second and then a third mortgage just to maintain the illusion of their lavish lifestyle. The primary debt was held by a private boutique investment bank located right here in downtown Atlanta, a bank that happened to be run by a man who owed me a massive professional favor. I pulled up my encrypted contact list and dialed Richard Sterling, the managing director of the bank, holding Jasmine's primary mortgage. Richard and I had done highly lucrative business together for years. 3 years ago, I had personally bailed his firm out of a catastrophic commercial zoning dispute that would have cost him tens of millions of dollars. I navigated the local city council, pulled the right strings, and secured the permits he desperately needed to save his flagship luxury development. He had promised me a favor, and in the cutthroat world of high stakes, Atlanta real estate favors were the ultimate currency. I told him I needed to see him immediately for a confidential, entirely off-the-books acquisition. I walked into Richard's mahogany-paneled office less than an hour later. I did not waste time with friendly small talk or polite pleasantries. I slid a sleek leather folder across his massive desk, containing the exact parcel number, the deed information, and the defaulted loan records for Jasmine's estate. I told him I was fully aware that the property was severely underwater and that the current owners were over 90 days delinquent on their payments. The bank was legally preparing to initiate foreclosure proceedings by the end of the month, a lengthy, exhausting process that would cost them time, bad press, and significant legal fees. I looked Richard dead in the eye and offered him an immediate all-cash buyout of the entire mortgage debt. I offered to purchase the distressed asset directly from his bank, taking the toxic debt entirely off his balance sheet that very morning. Richard was a sharp, highly pragmatic businessman. He did not ask questions about my personal motivations or why a luxury commercial developer wanted a deeply defaulted residential mortgage in Sandy Springs. He saw a massive pile of bad debt vanishing from his books, instantly replaced by guaranteed liquid capital. He called in his senior legal counsel, and the paperwork was drafted with breathtaking speed. To maintain absolute secrecy and prevent anyone in the Dubois family from uncovering my trap prematurely, I did not put the deed under my own name or my primary development firm. I had my legal team spin up a brand new, completely anonymous holding company registered in Wyoming. It was an ironclad corporate shield designed to hide my identity until the exact moment I chose to step out of the shadows and reveal it. I sat in the plush leather chair of the bank's conference room, sipping sparkling water, while the lawyers aggressively stamped and sealed the transfer documents. I signed my name on the final line with sharp, decisive strokes of my fountain pen. The wire transfer was initiated straight from my private independent wealth accounts, completely bypassing Marcus and any joint finances we held together. Millions of dollars shifted silently through the digital ether, and just like that, the transaction was absolutely final. The bank officially relinquished all claims to the property. My newly formed holding company was now the sole undisputed owner of the massive mountain of debt attached to Jasmine's estate. Because Jasmine was already severely in default and had ignored multiple final warnings from the bank, the legal clauses in the transfer agreement granted me immediate unrestricted power over the property. I possessed the legal right to execute a notice of immediate eviction. I held the absolute authority to order the county sheriffs to show up at her custom front door, drag her fake designer furniture out onto the manicured lawn, and change the locks. I literally owned the roof over her head, the imported hardwood floors she walked on, and the grand driveway she parked her least luxury cars on. She was living entirely on my property, breathing my air, and she had absolutely no idea her world had just been bought and paid for by the woman she was trying to destroy. I walked out of the bank and into the bright Atlanta afternoon, feeling a profound, intoxicating sense of absolute control. Jasmine was likely spending her day playing the role of the devoted traditional woman for my husband. She was probably texting him right now, whispering sweet, manipulative lies about their future together. She was plotting to steal his investment fund to pay off the very debt I had just legally acquired. The sheer, terrifying irony of her situation was almost poetic. She thought she was building an elaborate, foolproof trap to bury Marcus in federal court and force me out of the picture. But while she was entirely focused on playing petty emotional games and trying to win my husband's heart, I had quietly bought the entire board she was playing on. She was a clueless pawn, attempting to checkmate a queen. Later that afternoon, while I was organizing the final verified bank documents into my briefcase, Marcus called my cell phone. He sounded arrogant, highly distracted, and completely self-important. He reminded me that the 10th anniversary gala for his mother's charity foundation was quickly approaching this weekend, and he demanded that I clear my busy schedule to attend as his supportive wife. He reiterated his stern warning from the other night, strictly instructing me to be on my best behavior and to show Jasmine the utmost respect, claiming that the massive venture capital investment deal was reaching its final critical stages. He told me that Jasmine was bringing the official contracts to the gala, and he would be signing the paperwork in a private suite to secure his legacy. I listened to his condescending voice, the voice of a deeply foolish man, actively walking toward his own financial execution, and I felt nothing but cold, clinical detachment. I did not argue with him. I did not fight back or point out the glaring red flags. I kept my voice incredibly sweet, soft, and perfectly compliant. I assured him that I would absolutely be there, standing right by his side. I promised him that I was preparing a truly unforgettable entrance, and that he would remember this upcoming gala for the rest of his natural life. Marcus hung up the phone, feeling completely satisfied, fully believing he had successfully put me in my place. He thought I was finally surrendering to the crushing pressure of the Dubois family legacy and accepting my role as the silent, supportive background character. He had absolutely no clue that the woman he just spoke to was no longer his loving, desperate wife. I was the architect of his impending destruction. I slipped the heavy, sealed envelope containing the deed and the foreclosure rights to Jasmine's house into my briefcase, placing it right next to the black USB drive Chloe had given me. The trap was fully constructed, the doors were locked from the outside, and the final devastating pieces of the explosive puzzle were sliding perfectly into place. The heavy oak door of our penthouse slammed shut with a violent echoing crash that reverberated through the expansive hallway. I was seated calmly on the plush velvet sofa in the living room, a cup of chamomile tea resting lightly in my hands. I did not flinch at the deafening noise. I did not look up from the financial reports I was casually reviewing on my tablet. I knew exactly who was storming down the corridor, and I knew exactly why he was radiating such a frantic, explosive energy. Marcus marched directly into the living room, his custom-tailored suit jacket slung aggressively over one shoulder, and his tie yanked completely loose. His face was a dark, twisting storm of pure indignation. He stopped right in front of the glass coffee table, breathing heavily, and glared down at me as if I had just committed an unforgivable act of treason. He threw his leather briefcase onto the sofa next to me and demanded to know where I had been for the past 4 hours. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my tea, savoring the warmth, and placed the cup gently on its saucer. I looked up at my husband with a perfectly placid expression and stated that I was handling a highly sensitive, time-critical real estate acquisition for my firm. I told him my schedule had shifted unexpectedly, and my business required my immediate, undivided attention. My calm, rational explanation only threw gasoline onto the raging fire of his massive ego. Marcus threw his hands up in the air, letting out a sharp, mocking laugh that dripped with absolute contempt. He began pacing the length of the living room, his voice rising in volume and hostility with every step. He shouted that my little real estate errands were nothing compared to the monumental, life-changing meeting I had deliberately skipped. He reminded me with aggressive pointing gestures that today was the preliminary draft signing with Jasmine and the legal representatives of the massive venture capital firm she had miraculously secured for him. He stormed back over to me, leaning over the coffee table to invade my personal space. He told me that he had reserved a private VIP boardroom at the Capital City Club specifically for this historic occasion. He said he had expected his supposed life partner, to be sitting right there beside him, smiling and projecting the flawless image of a united, powerful black couple for his new billionaire investors. Instead, he had been forced to sit there making humiliating excuses for my glaring absence. He said I had made him look like a weak, unsupported man whose own wife could not even be bothered to show up and celebrate his greatest professional triumph. I watched him rant and rave, entirely fascinated by the sheer depth of his blindness. He was standing there, red in the face, completely outraged that I had missed a meeting with a group of phantom lawyers representing a fake shell company. He was furious that I did not sit in a luxury boardroom and smile while he eagerly reviewed the fraudulent paperwork designed to send him straight to a federal prison. He truly believed he had just spent his afternoon conquering the global financial market, when in reality he had just spent 4 hours willingly wrapping a legal noose tightly around his own neck. Marcus poured himself a generous glass of bourbon from the crystal decanter on the side table, his hands shaking slightly from his own toxic adrenaline. He took a long swallow and turned back to face me, his eyes narrowing with a dark, vicious cruelty. He told me he knew exactly why I had not shown up. He said my absence had absolutely nothing to do with a sudden business emergency and everything to do with my own petty, bitter jealousy. He accused me of intentionally boycotting the meeting because I simply could not handle the fact that Jasmine was the one handing him the keys to a billion-dollar empire. He boldly declared that my ego was so incredibly fragile and my heart was so bitter that I would rather see him fail than admit that another woman had done more for his legacy in a few short months than I had done in our entire marriage. He stood in the penthouse that my money had secured, drinking the expensive liquor. My income provided and proudly stated that Jasmine had proven her undeniable loyalty today, while I had proven my absolute selfishness. The audacity of his speech was truly breathtaking. He was entirely rewriting our history to fit the convenient, comfortable narrative that Jasmine and his mother had fed to him. He had completely erased the years of my grueling financial sacrifice, the late nights I spent restructuring his ruined credit, and the massive checks I wrote to save him from bankruptcy. In his twisted, arrogant mind, I was suddenly the anchor dragging him down, and Jasmine was the glorious savior lifting him into the stratosphere of black excellence. Marcus stepped closer, staring down at me with a look of pure, unadulterated disgust. He told me that a truly powerful man requires a woman who understands how to build a legacy, a woman who knows how to put her own selfish pride aside to elevate her husband. He said I had become so obsessed with my own independent success, so consumed by my desire to be the smartest person in the room, that I had lost every single ounce of my feminine grace. He aggressively pointed his finger at my chest and stated that I was entirely unworthy of the success he was about to achieve. He told me I did not deserve to stand beside him when he signed the final binding contracts at the charity gala tomorrow night, because I had proven myself to be a disloyal, ungrateful partner who actively tried to sabotage his happiness. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice to defend my honor or remind him of the countless times I had scraped him off the floor of his own failures. Fighting back would only validate his delusion that we were engaged in a marital power struggle. I simply sat there absorbing every single vicious insult, every cruel accusation, and every arrogant boast. I looked at his flushed face, his expensive suit, and his solid gold watch, and I felt a profound, chilling sense of pity. How was a dead man walking, strutting proudly toward his own execution, completely unaware that the ground beneath his feet had already crumbled away? I let his heavy, hateful words hang in the silent air of the living room for a long, agonizing moment. Then I slowly stood up from the sofa. I smoothed down the fabric of my tailored trousers, looked my husband directly in his angry, arrogant eyes, and gave him a soft, perfectly compliant smile. I told him he was absolutely right. I kept my voice incredibly smooth, completely void of any sarcasm or defensive anger. I apologized for letting my busy schedule interfere with such a monumental day in his career. I agreed that he deserved a partner who truly understood the massive magnitude of the documents he was about to sign. Marcus blinked, slightly disoriented by my sudden total surrender. He had clearly geared himself up for a massive screaming argument, and my calm, submissive agreement completely derailed his momentum. He let out a stiff, heavy breath, adjusting his posture to appear authoritative and triumphant. He told me he was glad I was finally taking some accountability for my poor behavior. He warned me that he expected absolute perfection from me at the gala tomorrow night. I demanded that I wear my best gown, paste a flawless smile on my face, and stand quietly by his side while he officially finalized the investment deal with Jasmine and her partners. He said he would not tolerate a single misstep or a single sour look from me, while the media and the elite members of Atlanta society watched him secure his family's legacy. I nodded slowly, my eyes locked on his. I promised him that tomorrow night would be the most flawlessly executed evening of his entire life. I assured him that I would not miss a single second of the final contract signing, and that everyone in that glamorous ballroom would witness exactly the kind of wife I truly was. I told him to go rest and prepare for his big day, because tomorrow would require every single ounce of his strength. Marcus gave a curt, satisfied nod, completely oblivious to the lethal double meaning of my words. He turned on his heel and marched toward the master suite, fully believing he had successfully dominated his rebellious wife and secured his glorious future. I stood in the center of the living room, listening to his heavy footsteps retreat down the hallway. I looked over at my leather briefcase resting near the front console table, containing the legal foreclosure documents that would render Jasmine completely homeless, and the encrypted drive that would send my husband to a federal penitentiary. Marcus wanted a flawless, unforgettable performance at his mother's charity gala. I was going to give him a show that would shatter his world into a million unrecoverable pieces. The morning sun pierced through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse, casting long, sharp shadows across the master suite. Marcus stood in front of the full-length mirror, his chest puffed out with the arrogant pride of a man who believed he was standing on the summit of the world. He was wrestling with a fresh silk tie, preparing for the final logistical meetings before the evening's grand charity gala. I walked up behind him, my footsteps completely silent against the plush carpet. I did not glare at him in the mirror. I did not bring up his vicious, unhinged rant from the previous night. I simply reached out, gently moved his hands aside, and began to expertly knot the silk fabric for him. Marcus looked down at me with a smug, highly satisfied expression. He clearly thought my act of service was a physical manifestation of my total submission, a silent apology for daring to focus on my own empire instead of blindly worshipping his. I smoothed the lapels of his tailored suit, meeting his gaze in the mirror with a sharp, flawlessly polite smile. I told him he needed to look absolutely perfect tonight. I kept my voice incredibly soft and sweet as I whispered that I was currently busy preparing a highly exclusive, unforgettable surprise gift for him at the anniversary gala tomorrow. I promised him it was something that would permanently alter the course of his entire legacy. Marcus chuckled, patting my hand dismissively. He told me he was glad I was finally embracing my role as a supportive wife and putting my energy into celebrating his success. He grabbed his briefcase and walked out the door, entirely oblivious to the lethal double-edged reality of my promise. The heavy click of the front door locking behind him was the starting gun for the most critical 24 hours of my life. While Marcus spent his morning driving across Atlanta to posture in front of his elite social circle, a massive, highly coordinated operation was quietly unfolding across the city. The contrast between the brilliant trap I was arming and the foolish fantasy Jasmine was living was almost cinematic. In the ultra-exclusive velvet-lined VIP fitting room of a luxury boutique in Buckhead, Jasmine was holding court. She stood on a circular pedestal sipping a flute of complimentary vintage champagne, while two exhausted attendants carefully pinned the hem of a breathtakingly expensive custom-beaded evening gown. She turned from side to side, admiring her reflection in the trifold mirrors, absolutely drunk on her own manufactured delusion. She was loudly bragging to the boutique manager about the multi-million-dollar venture capital deal she was closing tonight, playing the role of the incredibly wealthy financial power broker. She casually swiped a platinum credit card to pay for the exorbitant dress, a card that was undoubtedly stretched to its absolute breaking limit. She was buying armor for a victory lap she would never actually take, wrapping herself in thousands of dollars of stolen prestige while standing completely blind on the edge of a massive cliff. Simultaneously, in the sterile, soundproof, and heavily secured boardroom of my commercial real estate firm, I was dressed in a sharp, tailored black power suit, sitting at the head of a massive mahogany table. My chief legal counsel and my private wealth manager sat on either side of me, sliding a stack of thick, heavily watermarked documents across the polished wood. There was no champagne here. There was no bragging or performative laughter. There was only the cold, clinical execution of absolute financial ruin. I picked up my heavy gold fountain pen and began to sign the documents one by one. I signed the official authorization to execute the immediate transfer of Jasmine's deeply defaulted mortgage into the direct control of my anonymous Wyoming holding company. I signed the accelerated foreclosure notice waiving any standard grace periods due to the severe 90-day delinquency of the previous owner. I signed the legal mandate granting the county sheriff's department the absolute authority to enforce an immediate eviction and change the locks on the sprawling Sandy Springs estate. My signature was firm, sharp, and totally merciless. With every stroke of my pen, I was systematically stripping away the walls, the roof, and the very foundation of Jasmine's fake glamorous life. While she was busy pinning a dress she could not afford, I was legally purchasing the ground she walked on. As I handed the final stamped eviction order back to my legal team, my secure encrypted phone lit up with a message from Chloe. It was a single highly anticipated notification. The forensic audit was complete, bound, and ready for deployment. I left my office and drove directly to a discreet private coffee shop on the outskirts of the city to meet my sister-in-law. Chloe was already sitting in a corner booth, a thick, heavy leather binder resting on the table in front of her. She looked exhausted, Her eyes lined with shadows from staying up all night cross-referencing bank transfers, but she also looked incredibly sharp and fiercely victorious. She slid the leather binder across the table to me. She explained that inside were the certified, undeniable hard copies of the forensic financial report. Every single fraudulent wire transfer from Valerie's Church Charity Foundation to Jasmine's offshore shell companies was documented, highlighted, and backed by irrefutable federal banking codes. The fake venture capital contracts Marcus was preparing to sign tonight were completely dissected, exposing the exact clauses designed to transfer Jasmine's massive embezzlement debt directly onto his personal investment fund. Chloe then handed me a small metallic flash drive. She told me this drive contained a condensed, highly visual presentation of the most damning financial graphs and the explicit proof of the shell company's fraudulent nature. She had formatted it specifically to be compatible with the high-end audio-visual projection system at the St. Regis Ballroom where the gala was being held. We did not need to speak about the mechanics of how I would get it on the screens. We both knew I had the money and the influence to bypass any event coordinator in the city. I placed the binder and the flash drive into my briefcase, locking the heavy brass clasps. I looked at Chloe and thanked her for her brilliant, fearless work. She simply smiled, took a sip of her coffee, and told me to give them absolute hell. The afternoon bled into the early evening, and the atmosphere in Atlanta grew thick with the heavy anticipation of the high society event of the year. In her grand, sprawling estate, Valerie was barking orders at a team of florists and event planners over the phone, demanding absolute perfection for the celebration of her charity foundation's 10th anniversary. She was obsessed with ensuring the Dubois family name shone brighter than ever, completely unaware that the very foundation she was celebrating had been hollowed out and plundered by the woman she treated like a surrogate daughter. Back in my penthouse, I stood alone in the master suite preparing for the night that would change everything. I did not choose a soft, submissive dress. I chose a stunning structured floor-length gown in a shade of deep, commanding midnight blue. It was a dress designed for a woman who owned the room, not a woman who stood in the background. I applied my makeup with sharp, precise strokes, pulling my hair back into a sleek, elegant style that left my face entirely open and unbothered. I looked at my reflection in the massive vanity mirror. I did not look like Marcus's quiet, supportive wife anymore. I looked like a reckoning. I walked out to the living room and picked up my luxury clutch, slipping the metallic flash drive into the silk-lined pocket. I picked up my leather briefcase, feeling the heavy, satisfying weight of the forensic audit binder and the signed foreclosure orders resting securely inside. The trap was armed. The evidence was irrefutable. The legal mechanisms were already locked into motion. Marcus, Valerie, and Jasmine were all marching proudly toward the grand ballroom, fully expecting to celebrate their wealth, their status, and their ultimate victory over me. They were completely blinded by their own arrogance. I took a deep, steadying breath, opened the door to the private elevator, and stepped inside. It was time to go to the gala. It was time to deliver my surprise gift. The valet took the keys to my matte black sedan as I stepped onto the red carpet, unrolling down the grand entrance of the St. Regis Hotel. Flashbulbs erupted immediately. The local Atlanta Press elite society bloggers and heavy-hitting financial columnists were out in full force to cover the Dubois family and their crowning charitable achievements. I glided past the velvet ropes with absolute precision. The heavy midnight blue silk of my gown moved like liquid armor around me. I handed my tailored coat to the coat check attendant, but kept a firm, white-knuckled grip on my luxury clutch. The weapon was secure. The 10th anniversary gala for the Grace and Legacy Foundation was an aggressive, unapologetic display of staggering wealth. Massive, towering floral arrangements of imported white orchids and hydrangeas cascaded from the center of every dining table. A 12-piece string orchestra played flawless classical renditions of iconic R&B anthems from a raised stage. Waiters carrying silver trays of vintage champagne wove seamlessly through a tightly packed crowd of powerful politicians, cutthroat real estate tycoons, and highly influential mega-church pastors. This was my mother-in-law Valerie's ultimate kingdom. I spotted my husband and his mother immediately. They were holding court near the main media wall at the front of the ballroom. Marcus looked incredibly sharp in his custom velvet tuxedo jacket. He was aggressively shaking hands with a prominent city councilman, flashing that brilliant, trustworthy smile that made investors empty their bank accounts. Valerie stood right beside him, draped in heavy diamonds that sparked blindingly under the harsh media lighting. They were soaking up the absolute adoration of the room, projecting the absolute pinnacle of black excellence. I approached them with slow, measured steps. Marcus noticed my arrival, and his posture instantly stiffened just a fraction. He quickly scanned my appearance, his eyes darting over my face and dress, actively searching for any lingering sign of rebellion or emotional distress from our massive fight the night before. When he saw my flawless hair, my striking designer gown, and my perfectly compliant warm smile, he let out a highly visible breath of relief. He actually reached out and pulled me tightly to his side, proudly telling the councilman that his beautiful, successful wife had just arrived. It was a spectacular, Oscar-worthy performance of marital unity. Valerie gave me a tight, approving nod. In their minds, I was finally following the script. I was playing the good, silent, supportive wife who knew how to put her own pride aside for the sake of the family legacy. Then the entire energy in the massive ballroom shifted. A distinct ripple of whispers moved quickly through the crowd near the grand staircase. Jasmine made her debut. She walked down the sweeping carpeted steps, wearing the exact custom-beaded crimson evening gown. I knew she had practically begged her completely maxed-out credit cards to cover. The dress hugged every single curve of her body, catching the chandelier light with thousands of hand-sewn glittering crystals. She looked breathtakingly expensive. She completely masked the terrifying fact that her financial world was entirely bankrupt and she was days away from a brutal eviction. She walked with the arrogant, heavy, demanding stride of a woman who fully believed she had already won the war. She completely bypassed the standard greeting line and marched straight toward our inner circle at the press wall. She did not even look at me. Her eyes were locked entirely hungrily on Marcus. She greeted Valerie with an exaggerated, highly theatrical kiss on both cheeks, loudly congratulating her on 10 years of remarkable, life-changing charity work. Valerie absolutely beamed under the flattery. She took Jasmine's hands and loudly proclaimed that none of tonight's upcoming, historic financial announcements would be possible without Jasmine's brilliant, unmatched networking skills. The lead photographer from Atlanta's premier society magazine stepped forward. He asked to get a formal front-page portrait of the foundation's president, the primary investment fund manager, and the key financial consultant who was supposedly brokering tonight's massive venture capital deal. It was a massive public relations moment. The cameras were ready to capture the architects of the new Dubois empire. As we arranged ourselves against the branded step and repeat backdrop, I took my rightful legal place at my husband's right side. But Jasmine was absolutely not going to let that happen. She moved with aggressive, highly calculated speed. She stepped directly between Marcus and me, using the heavy, structured, sweeping train of her crimson dress to physically block my space and push me backward. She reached out and wrapped her hands tightly, possessively around Marcus's bicep. She pressed her body flush against his side and leaned her head slightly toward his shoulder, posing confidently for the flashing cameras, as if she were the actual matriarch of his entire life. The photographer raised his heavy camera, gesturing with his hand for all of us to squeeze in tighter to fit the frame. Jasmine took that exact direction as her cue to strike. She took one more sharp, deliberate step backward, driving the sharp stiletto heel of her designer shoe directly and painfully into the toe of my foot. She used her shoulder to physically edge me right out of the center frame, pushing me so far to the periphery that I was barely standing on the edge of the branded red carpet. I looked at my husband. Marcus did not correct her. He did not pull his wife back into the center of the photograph. He did not ask her to step aside. He simply smiled his million-dollar camera-ready smile for the blinding flashes totally and willingly, allowing his childhood friend to publicly replace me in the visual hierarchy of his own family. The camera flashes blinded us for a solid 10 seconds, lighting up the tension in the group. In the chaos of the flashing lights and the shouting photographers directing our poses, Jasmine tilted her head back just an inch toward me. She did not look at me. She kept her bright, victorious, perfectly white smile fixed directly on the camera lenses. But she lowered her voice so only I could hear her toxic words over the classical music and the noisy crowd. She whispered that I should take a good hard look at the monitors when the photos were published tomorrow morning. She said this picture right here is exactly what perfection looks like. She told me with pure dripping venom that I was finally standing exactly where I belonged, completely pushed out of the frame, entirely irrelevant to his glorious future, and totally powerless to stop what was coming next. The sheer audacity in her whisper was entirely designed to break me. It was a calculated, vicious strike meant to make me snap, to cause a massive scene on the red carpet, and to give them all the crazy, jealous, unhinged wife narrative they so desperately wanted to use against me. But I did not react. I did not shove her back, or try to physically reclaim my spot next to a man who was utterly, completely worthless to me. I just maintained my flawless, icy polite smile. I looked straight at the flashing cameras and thought about the small, heavily encrypted flash drive resting securely inside my clutch. I thought about the anonymous Wyoming holding company that now legally and permanently owned the deed to the mansion Jasmine would desperately try to go home to tonight. Jasmine truly thought she was securing her permanent place in high society history with this photograph. She thought she was capturing the exact moment she finally conquered me and took my throne. But she was actually just documenting the very last 10 minutes of her entire fake fraudulent existence. I let her cling to my husband's arm like a desperate parasite. I let Valerie smile proudly at the two of them, as if they were the golden couple of Atlanta. I let them have their perfect, beautiful, glittering lie for just a few moments longer. The photographers finally finished their extensive set and lowered their heavy cameras. The gala coordinator's voice suddenly echoed loudly through the massive ballroom speakers, asking all esteemed guests to please take their seats for the opening remarks and the highly anticipated financial presentations. The time for taking pretty pictures and playing petty social games was officially over. The execution was about to begin. The guests moved toward their assigned tables in a chaotic flurry of rustling silk and clinking champagne flutes. I walked alongside Marcus, taking my seat at the primary table of honor, situated directly in front of the grand stage. Marcus pulled out my chair, executing a flawlessly polite gesture for the lingering cameras before taking his own seat to my left. Jasmine was seated immediately to his right, a seating arrangement Valerie had clearly orchestrated to maximize my humiliation. Jasmine settled into her chair, smoothing the beaded fabric of her crimson gown, still radiating that toxic, unearned confidence. Valerie stood at the main podium on the raised stage, tapping her manicured fingernail against the microphone to command the attention of the massive ballroom. The room quieted instantly. Valerie smiled her signature aristocratic smile. She welcomed the prominent politicians, the mega-church leaders, the real estate moguls, and the city elite. She delivered a flowery, self-aggrandizing speech about the unparalleled legacy of the Dubois family and the 10 glorious years of the Grace and Legacy Foundation. She spoke about the millions of dollars raised for underprivileged communities and how tonight marked the dawn of a new financial era for her son. Then her smile tightened into a rigid line. She looked down at our table and announced that to offer a toast to family unity and Marcus's historic new venture, she would like to invite her daughter-in-law to say a few words. It was a blatant power play. She fully expected me to stand at that podium and publicly grovel to sing their praises and submit to my role as the silent financial backer of their glamorous lives. I stood up slowly. I smoothed the heavy fabric of my midnight blue gown and walked up the carpeted steps to the stage with absolute terrifying calm. I stepped up to the acrylic podium and adjusted the microphone. I looked out over the sea of powerful, expectant faces. I looked down at Marcus, who was watching me with a stern, warning glare, silently demanding that I stick to the script. I looked at Jasmine, who was swirling her wine glass with a smug, victorious smirk. I did not pull out a written speech. I looked directly toward the dark glass of the audio-visual control booth at the far end of the ballroom. I gave a single sharp nod to the technician. I had personally paid triple his monthly salary to hijack the evening's presentation. The glittering crystal chandeliers above us dimmed immediately. The three massive high-definition projection screens spanning the entire back wall of the stage, which were supposed to display a touching promotional video of the charity's history, suddenly flared to life with blinding white light. But there were no smiling children or ribbon-cutting ceremonies on those screens. Instead, the displays projected a stark, high-resolution scan of an incredibly detailed corporate financial spreadsheet. Across the dead center of the massive central screen, a heavy, undeniable red stamp glared at the audience. It read, "Forensic Audit Certified." I leaned into the microphone. My voice was smooth, icy, and perfectly amplified across the cavernous ballroom. I welcomed the esteemed guests. I stated that tonight was indeed a night of historic financial revelations. I told the audience that before my husband signed any monumental new contracts, it was my strict professional duty as a corporate developer to ensure the foundation's books were perfectly transparent for its generous donors. I clicked the small presentation remote concealed in my palm. The screens instantly shifted to a complex but incredibly clear color-coded financial flowchart created by Chloe's brilliant forensic mind. I spoke directly to the elite donors sitting in the front rows. I asked the pastors and the politicians to look very closely at the outgoing vendor payments from the past 18 months. I used the laser pointer to highlight three specific companies listed on the screen. I explained in a clinical boardroom tone that these three specific companies had billed the Grace and Legacy Foundation for over $2.4 million in alleged event management, community outreach, and floral design services. I clicked the remote again. The screens transitioned to display the official state corporate registry documents for these three vendors. I pointed out that none of these companies possessed a physical footprint, an employee payroll, or a legitimate tax history. They were ghost entities registered to a single obscure post office box in the state of Delaware. A low, confused murmur began to ripple through the crowd. The clinking of silverware stopped completely. The prominent megachurch pastor sitting at the table next to ours set his glass down, his brow furrowing as he leaned forward to read the massive numbers projected on the screen. Valerie stood frozen at the edge of the stage, the color draining entirely from her face. She took a hesitant step toward the podium, whispering frantically for me to turn the screens off, but I completely ignored her. I clicked the remote for the third time. I told the audience that we were going to follow the money. The screens displayed the exact offshore routing numbers where their generous charitable donations had been systematically transferred. I traced the digital flow of the stolen funds from the Delaware shell companies through a series of blindingly fast wire transfers in the Cayman Islands. And then I displayed the final devastating destination. The massive screens split into a side-by-side comparative analysis. On the left side of the screen, the audience watched the embezzled charity funds entering a private domestic banking account. On the right side of the screen, they saw the exact matching outward payments from that very same account. The evidence was irrefutable. The stolen charity money was directly funding high-interest predatory credit cards, luxury vehicle leases, and a specific heavily defaulted mortgage in Sandy Springs. I lowered the laser pointer. I looked directly down at the table of honor. I locked eyes with Jasmine. The arrogant, victorious smirk had completely vanished from her face. She looked as though all the oxygen had been violently sucked out of her lungs. Her jaw hung slightly open, her eyes darting frantically from the undeniable financial records on the massive screens back to my completely unbothered, ruthless expression. I spoke into the microphone with absolute chilling authority. I stated, clearly enunciating every single syllable, that the millions of dollars meant for underprivileged communities and emergency relief programs had actually been siphoned off to fund the lavish, fraudulent lifestyle of the Foundation's very own special financial consultant. I kept my eyes pinned on Jasmine as I told the entire room of Atlanta high society that the custom-beaded, crimson evening gown she was currently wearing had been purchased just yesterday afternoon at a Buckhead boutique, and it had been paid for using a credit line funded directly by the Grace and Legacy Foundation's Housing Relief Initiative. The ballroom exploded. The polite, confused murmurs instantly escalated into a chaotic uproar of gasps, shouts, and aggressive chatter. Chairs scraped loudly against the floor as several prominent donors stood up, their faces twisted in absolute outrage. The flashes of press cameras which had been resting on tables suddenly erupted again, capturing the sheer panic sweeping across the room. The reporters in the back scrambled for their audio recorders, realizing they were witnessing the total destruction of an Atlanta dynasty in real time. Valerie let out a strangled, breathless sound. She grabbed the edge of the stage to steady herself, her diamond necklaces shaking violently against her chest. She stared at the screens, her eyes wide with total, unadulterated horror, as she finally comprehended the magnitude of the betrayal. She had blindly signed off on every single one of those fake invoices. Her signature was officially tied to the massive embezzlement of her own beloved charity. Marcus sat rigidly in his chair, completely paralyzed. As an investment fund manager, he did not need anyone to translate the data on the screens for him. He read the routing numbers, the timestamps, and the irrefutable forensic paper trail. His professional mind processed the undeniable mathematics of the massive federal crime projected in front of him. He slowly turned his head to look at Jasmine, the woman he had aggressively defended, the woman he had allowed to humiliate his wife, the woman who had just handed him a contract designed to make him the sole legal fall guy for her multi-million-dollar heist. The look of absolute soul-crushing horror and betrayal that washed over my husband's face was a masterpiece I will never forget. He realized in that exact moment that his childhood best friend was not his savior. She was his executioner, and I was the only thing standing between him and a federal prison cell. I stood at the podium watching the absolute devastation ripple through my husband's eyes. I did not lower the microphone. The room was incredibly loud, but my voice cut through the chaos with razor-sharp clarity. I turned my attention directly to Marcus. I told him to pull the preliminary investment contract out of his tuxedo jacket pocket. I instructed him to turn specifically to page 64. I explained to the entire room of horrified investors and board members that the multi-million-dollar venture capital deal Jasmine had brokered was nothing more than a lethal, highly calculated legal death trap. I detailed the exact cross-collateralization clauses hidden deeply within the fine print of that document. I told Marcus that the moment he signed his name on that dotted line, his legitimate investment fund would legally absorb the entirety of Jasmine's $2.4 million embezzlement debt. I made it undeniably clear that when the federal auditors arrived to investigate the missing charity funds, Jasmine would walk away completely free of any financial burden. Marcus, on the other hand, would be left standing as the sole guarantor of the stolen money and would be handed a minimum 10-year sentence in a federal penitentiary for wire fraud. Jasmine finally snapped out of her paralyzed, breathless state. She lunged forward toward the stage, her face twisted in a desperate, ugly panic that completely shattered her glamorous facade. She screamed at the top of her lungs that the documents displayed on the projection screens were entirely fabricated. She pointed a shaking, manicured finger at me and shouted to the crowd that I was a jealous, bitter, unstable wife trying to frame her with photoshopped bank statements. She frantically turned and grabbed Marcus by the arm, begging him not to believe my lies. She pleaded with him to remember their lifelong friendship and their sacred bond, desperately trying to deploy the exact same manipulative tactics that had worked flawlessly for her just a few days ago. Marcus looked down at the hand clutching his velvet jacket. He looked at the woman who had spent months poisoning his marriage, stroking his massive ego, and actively plotting his absolute destruction behind a sweet smile. He did not gently pull away from her grasp. He aggressively shoved Jasmine's hand off his arm with a level of sheer physical revulsion I had never seen from him before. He stepped back from her as if she were a highly contagious, dangerous disease. He pulled the thick, heavily bound investment contract from his inner breast pocket and threw it directly at her chest. The heavy paper scattered across the pristine white tablecloth, fluttering to the floor like dead leaves. He told her in a voice shaking with pure, unadulterated rage that he never wanted her to speak his name again. The reality of her catastrophic failure hit Jasmine with crushing force. The room full of Atlanta's most powerful politicians and elite socialites were not looking at her with envy or admiration anymore. They were looking at her with absolute, unfiltered disgust. The prominent megachurch pastor sitting at the adjacent table was already on his cell phone, loudly demanding that his legal team contact the authorities immediately regarding the stolen community funds. Jasmine was entirely surrounded, trapped in a grand ballroom filled with the very people she had just been exposed for robbing. At the edge of the stage, the crushing weight of the scandal finally took its physical toll on my mother-in-law. Valerie let out a sharp, breathless gasp that echoed over the ambient noise of the crowd. Her hands flew to her chest, clutching her heavy diamond necklace tightly as her knees completely buckled beneath her. She collapsed onto the carpeted floor of the ballroom, her immaculate white mink coat pooling around her like a surrendered flag. The grand, untouchable matriarch of the Dubois family was instantly reduced to a hyperventilating, weeping mess. She was completely destroyed by the sudden realization that her arrogant, blind trust in Jasmine had single-handedly annihilated the flawless family legacy she had spent decades building. It was not Jasmine who rushed to help the fallen queen of Atlanta society. It was not Marcus who was still standing completely paralyzed by the shock of his own narrow escape. It was Chloe. The brilliant daughter-in-law Valerie had relentlessly bullied, mocked, and aggressively attempted to push out of the family, rushed forward without a single second of hesitation. Chloe knelt on the floor beside the woman who had made her life absolutely miserable. She calmly loosened Valerie's expensive collar and instructed a nearby waiter to call for paramedics. The absolute grace and professionalism Chloe displayed in that moment of crisis only magnified the sheer ugliness of the Dubois family's previous behavior toward her. I remained standing at the podium completely untouched by the sheer panic and destruction unfolding below me. I looked down at Marcus. His eyes slowly lifted from the scattered contracts on the floor to meet my gaze. The arrogance, the condescension, the absolute certainty that he was the smartest man in the room was entirely gone. He looked at me with a terrifying, agonizing realization. He finally understood that the woman he had dismissed as a petty, jealous, and unsupportive wife was the only reason he was not leaving this charity gala in federal handcuffs. I had let him walk right up to the very edge of the cliff, and I had pulled him back at the absolute last possible second. But I did not do it out of love, and I certainly did not do it to save our crumbling marriage. I did it because I needed him to know exactly what he was losing. Jasmine's frantic eyes darted around the ballroom, desperately searching for a single sympathetic face among the wealthy elite she had tried so hard to impress. Finding absolutely no one, her panic instantly mutated into a cornered feral rage. She turned her entire body toward the stage, pointing a shaking, manicured finger directly at me. Her voice cracked as she shrieked that I was a complete psychopath. She screamed to the silent, watching crowd that I had orchestrated this entire elaborate setup out of pure bitter jealousy. She wildly accused me of hacking into bank servers to fabricate the offshore accounts, claiming I was trying to destroy an innocent woman, simply because my husband loved her more. She was thrashing in the water aggressively, trying to pull anyone down into the deep end with her. I did not entertain her unhinged performance with a response over the microphone. I simply reached out and switched the audio feed off, letting her frantic, baseless accusations echo against the cold, stunned silence of the room. I smoothed the heavy fabric of my midnight blue gown and descended the carpeted steps of the stage. The crowd of powerful investors, politicians, and socialites physically parted for me as I walked. They instinctively stepped back, clearing a wide, unobstructed path directly to the table of honor. I moved with the slow, deliberate grace of a woman who had already won the war. I stopped right in front of Jasmine. She was breathing heavily, her chest heaving against the custom-beaded crimson dress she had bought with stolen charity funds just yesterday. I opened my luxury clutch and pulled out the thick, heavy manila envelope I had carried with me all night. I did not throw it. I simply let it drop from my fingers. It landed squarely on the center of the white tablecloth, with a heavy, definitive thud, resting right next to the scattered, useless investment contracts Marcus had thrown at her moments earlier. Jasmine stared down at the sealed envelope, her manicured hands trembling uncontrollably. I looked her dead in the eye, stripping away every single ounce of my polite high society facade. I kept my voice perfectly level, but loud enough for Marcus and the surrounding tables to hear every single syllable. I reminded her of the exact moment she stood in the hotel lobby and poured a cocktail on my chest. I repeated her vicious, arrogant words right back to her. I told her she had boldly claimed I was nothing more than a safe, boring consolation prize. I reminded her that she had looked me in the eye and stated I was merely a placeholder just biding time until she was ready to claim what was always meant to be hers. I took a half step closer, invading her space the exact way she had invaded my kitchen just days ago. I told her she was absolutely right about one specific thing. Someone was indeed holding on to a highly valuable asset until the true owner was ready to claim it. I tapped my fingernail against the heavy envelope on the table. I announced to Jasmine and to the entire listening room that those enclosed documents were certified expedited foreclosure and eviction notices. I explained with absolute surgical precision that my private commercial real estate firm had purchased the entirety of her defaulted severely underwater mortgage this very morning. The last drop of color drained entirely from Jasmine's face. Her knees visibly buckled, forcing her to grab the edge of the dining table to keep from collapsing onto the carpet. I looked at the woman who had tried to steal my husband, my wealth, and my dignity. I delivered the final, inescapable truth. I told her that she did not just owe $2.4 million to the federal authorities. I told her she was completely, utterly homeless. I looked her up and down with absolute, freezing contempt and stated that she had exactly 24 hours to pack her fake designer bags and get out of my house. The heavy brass doors of the ballroom swung open with a resounding thud that snapped the remaining tension in the room. Two uniformed Atlanta police officers, accompanied by a federal investigator in a sharp suit, marched straight down the center aisle. They did not pause to admire the floral arrangements or the crystal chandeliers. They walked directly to our table. The federal investigator held up a formal warrant, his voice booming over the stunned silence of the crowd. He announced that Jasmine was being officially summoned for immediate questioning regarding the severe financial discrepancies within the Grace and Legacy Foundation. Jasmine did not scream this time. The absolute reality of her federal crime had finally crushed her arrogant spirit. She looked completely hollowed out, her face a mask of pale terror, as the officers flanked her sides and escorted her away from the glittering table of honor. She walked out of this ballroom in the exact same crimson dress she thought would be her victory gown, now looking like a prisoner taking her final walk. Down on the floor near the edge of the stage, Valerie was slowly regaining her breath. Paramedics had just arrived, but she waved away the oxygen mask, her trembling hands gripping Chloe's arm for support. The untouchable matriarch of the Dubois family looked up at the young white woman she had relentlessly mocked and excluded for years. Chloe did not gloat. She simply helped her mother-in-law sit up, displaying the exact kind of quiet, dignified grace Valerie had falsely claimed to possess. Valerie slowly turned her head to look at me, standing tall and completely unbothered by the table. The terrifying realization washed over her aging face. The two daughters-in-law she had viciously belittled, the women she deemed unworthy of her sacred family legacy, were the only reason she was not currently being handcuffed and dragged out right next to Jasmine. We had intercepted the bullet aimed directly at her empire, and the crushing weight of her own foolish hypocrisy left her entirely speechless. I did not wait for an apology from Valerie. I turned my back on the ruined table of honor and began walking toward the main exit. My posture was perfectly straight, my steps measured and calm. I had barely made it halfway across the massive ballroom when I heard heavy, desperate footsteps rushing up behind me. Marcus grabbed my wrist, pulling me around to face him. He looked absolutely destroyed. His custom velvet tuxedo was rumpled, his breathing was frantic, and his eyes were wide with a pathetic, overwhelming desperation. He pleaded with me, his voice cracking as he begged for my forgiveness. He swore he had been completely blinded by Jasmine's manipulation. He promised he would spend the rest of his life making it up to me, begging me to stay, and help him fix the catastrophic mess his mother's charity was now facing. He said we were a team, a power couple, and that he desperately needed his brilliant wife. I looked down at the hand gripping my wrist, then stared directly into his panicked, pleading eyes. I firmly pulled my arm away from his grasp, stepping back to put a cold, undeniable physical distance between us. I kept my voice perfectly level, stripping away any trace of the supportive woman I used to be. I told him he had made his choice the moment he stood in the St. Regis courtyard, and demanded I swallow my pride to protect the woman who had intentionally humiliated me. I said he had actively chosen to believe the sweet lies of his toxic best friend, instead of trusting the fierce loyalty of his own wife. I looked him dead in the eye and delivered my final inescapable verdict. I told him my lawyer would be sending the official divorce papers to his office by tomorrow morning, and I strongly suggested he find a new real estate developer to fund his legal defense. I turned away from my soon-to-be ex-husband and continued my walk toward the grand exit. Chloe was already waiting for me near the towering floral archway by the doors. She held two crystal flutes of vintage champagne she had effortlessly swiped from a passing waiter's tray. She handed one to me with a sharp, victorious smile. We did not need to say a single word about the absolute devastation we were leaving behind. We simply clinked our glasses together, the delicate crystal ringing with a bright, triumphant sound. I took a slow sip of the cold champagne, turned my back on the chaotic, crumbling ruins of the Dubois family legacy, and walked out into the cool Atlanta night, stepping entirely into my absolute freedom.